August 15, 1945, Okinawa, Japan. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the makeshift prisoner processing center that had been established in what was once an elementary school. Staff Sergeant Marcus Johnson of the 24th Infantry Regiment, a segregated African-American unit, stood at attention as a group of disheveled Japanese women were escorted through the gates. The women believed they were about to face unspeakable treatment from their American captors, particularly from the black soldiers they had been told were cannibals. None of them could have imagined that this encounter would shatter decades of propaganda and transform their understanding of humanity itself. Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the untold story of how a group of Japanese women, prisoners of war, and African-American soldiers of the segregated U.S. Army overcame language barriers, propaganda, and mutual fear to discover a common humanity amid the ashes of the Pacific War. The journey of Staff Sergeant Marcus Johnson to Okinawa had been a long one. Born in Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1920, he had grown up in the shadow of one of America's worst racial massacres. His father, a World War I veteran who had fought in the 92nd Infantry Division, had barely escaped the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre that destroyed their family home and business. Growing up, Marcus absorbed his father's complicated patriotism, a fierce love of country, alongside a clear-eyed view of its failings. "America ain't perfect, son," his father would say, "but it's ours to fight for and make better." When Pearl Harbor was attacked in December 1941, Marcus was working as a mechanic in Chicago after 2 years at Fisk University. He enlisted immediately, despite knowing he would serve in a segregated military that often assigned black troops to service and support roles rather than combat. "I wanted to prove something," he later wrote in a letter to his mother, "to them, to myself, to everyone who said we couldn't fight." After basic training, Marcus was assigned to the 24th Infantry Regiment, one of the historic Buffalo Soldier regiments that dated back to the post-Civil War era. The unit had a proud history, having served in the Spanish-American War, the Philippine-American War, and along the Mexican border. Despite this legacy, the 24th, like other black units, faced systemic discrimination within the military structure. By early 1945, as the Pacific War entered its final and bloodiest phase, the 24th Infantry Regiment was deployed to the Pacific Theater. After the brutal Battle of Okinawa, which claimed over 200 Rowan's-Orton lives, including many Okinawan civilians, the regiment was assigned to occupation and prisoner processing duties. On the other side of this encounter stood Akiko Tanaka, 24, a former schoolteacher from Nagoya who had been drafted into the Women's Volunteer Corps in 1944 as Japan's war situation grew desperate. Along with thousands of other women, she had been sent to Okinawa to serve as a nurse's aide in field hospitals. As American forces overwhelmed the island's defenses in June 1945, Akiko and 17 other women had hidden in a cave for weeks, surviving on rainwater and whatever food they could scavenge. "We were certain death was better than capture," Akiko later recalled in a rare 1985 interview with the Japanese Historical Society. "Everything we had been told about Americans, especially the black soldiers, made us believe that unspeakable things awaited us if we surrendered." Japanese wartime propaganda had painted all Americans as demons, Kichikubei, demonic beast Americans in English, but reserved special terror for black soldiers. Pamphlets, radio broadcasts, and officers warned that African-American troops were former cannibals, barely civilized, who had been recruited from prisons specifically because of their violent nature. Some propaganda claimed they had filed teeth and would eat Japanese prisoners. Alongside Akiko was Yumiko Ito, 19, the daughter of a naval officer who had been killed at Midway. Yumiko had volunteered out of a sense of patriotic duty and family honor. There was also Sachiko Nakamura, 26, a widow whose husband had died in fighting in the Philippines, and Haruko Watanabe, 20, who had worked in an aircraft factory before being drafted into the Volunteer Corps. Each woman carried not only her own story, but the weight of Imperial Japan's totalitarian indoctrination. Their group also included Masako Shimizu, 32, who provided a different perspective. Having lived in San Francisco for 6 years as a child while her father worked as a merchant, Masako harbored private doubts about the demonized portrayal of Americans. However, she kept these thoughts to herself, knowing that expressing such views could lead to accusations of being an American sympathizer or spy. Lieutenant Robert Franklin, 29, a former history teacher from Philadelphia, served as the officer in charge of the processing center on that fateful day. Franklin had studied at Howard University before the war and brought an intellectual's perspective to his military service. He understood that this occupation represented not just a military mission, but a profound cultural encounter. How we treat these people now will determine whether they see democracy as just another foreign power or as something fundamentally different, he had told his men during their briefing. Each of you represents not just the U.S. Army, but the possibility of a different kind of world after all this bloodshed. The processing center had been established to handle the thousands of Japanese military and civilian prisoners who emerged from hiding after the formal Japanese surrender on August 15, 1945. While most military prisoners were being held elsewhere, the center focused on civilian detainees and non-combat personnel, including the Women's Volunteer Corps members. When Akiko and her group were brought in, they were among the first Japanese women many of the American soldiers had encountered face to face. The women, expecting the worst, walked with eyes downcast, some quietly weeping, others maintaining the stoic demeanor that Japanese society had ingrained in them. Staff Sergeant Johnson was assigned to oversee their initial processing, working with a Nisei, second-generation Japanese-American interpreter, Corporal David Suzuki, whose family was ironically being held in an internment camp back in California. As the women were led into the processing area, Akiko glanced up and froze at the sight of Johnson. At 6'2" with broad shoulders and dark skin, he embodied everything the propaganda had taught her to fear. She instinctively stepped back, bumping into Yumiko, who let out a small cry when she too saw the black soldiers. "It's okay," Corporal Suzuki said in Japanese. "No one is going to hurt you. These are American soldiers. They're here to process you and make sure you receive food and medical attention." The women huddled together, unconvinced. Masako, drawing on her memories of America, whispered to the others, "I've seen Negro people before in America. The propaganda isn't true." Johnson, sensing their fear, had encountered similar reactions before. Throughout the Pacific Campaign, Japanese soldiers would often fight to the death rather than surrender to black troops, believing the propaganda that they would be tortured or eaten. "Tell them they're safe here," Johnson instructed Suzuki. "Tell them we're just going to get them registered, fed, and checked by a doctor if they need it." As Suzuki translated, Johnson slowly removed a chocolate bar from his pocket and broke it into pieces, offering it first to the youngest woman in the group, 18-year-old Emi Takahashi. The gesture, simple as it was, cut through layers of fear. Emi hesitated, then took the chocolate with a slight bow. The registration process began with recording names, ages, and hometowns. When it was Akiko's turn, she stood rigidly before Johnson, avoiding eye contact. "Name?" Suzuki translated. "Tanaka Akiko," she replied quietly. "Age? 24. Hometown? Nagoya." Johnson wrote down her information on the form, then handed her an identification card with a number. As she reached for it, her eyes inadvertently met his. What she saw wasn't the monster of propaganda, but a tired young man not much different in age from her brother who had been killed in the Philippines. The moment passed quickly, but something shifted in Akiko's perception. The concrete reality of this human being began to challenge the abstract enemy she had been taught to fear. The first day of processing went without incident. Though tension remained palpable, the women were assigned to a separate area of the compound, given basic supplies, and fed their first substantial meal in weeks: rice, beans, canned fruit, and coffee. Many were too nervous to eat much, still suspecting that acceptance of American food might be dangerous or dishonorable. That night, as they settled onto their cots in what had once been a school classroom, the women whispered among themselves. "They don't seem like demons," Yumiko ventured quietly. "It could be a trick," Sachiko responded. Remember what the officers told us about Americans treating prisoners well at first, then using them for experiments. Masako spoke up, her voice just above a whisper. I saw Negro people in San Francisco when I was a child. They were just people. Some were kind, some weren't, like anyone else. But these soldiers, Haruko said, they're so different looking. Their skin, their height. How can we trust what we don't understand? We have no choice, Akiko concluded pragmatically. We're alive. For now, that has to be enough. The following morning brought a significant change. Lieutenant Franklin had decided to assign several women from the group to work in the processing center's kitchen and laundry facilities. This decision was partly pragmatic. They needed the help, but also strategic. Franklin believed that meaningful work would help the women adjust and begin to see themselves as people with agency, rather than just prisoners. Johnson, Franklin called, I need you to take these 4 to the kitchen and get them settled with Sergeant Wilson. The 4 women selected were Akiko, Masako, Haruko, and Sachiko. As Johnson led them across the compound, he noticed they no longer walked with heads bowed, but were taking in their surroundings with cautious curiosity. The kitchen was a hive of activity, with army cooks preparing breakfast for hundreds of soldiers and detainees. Sergeant Wilson, a barrel-chested man from Georgia with 20 years of army service, greeted them with a nod. These the Japanese ladies? He asked Johnson. Good. We can use the help. Tell them they'll be washing dishes and prepping vegetables to start. Through Corporal Suzuki, who accompanied them as interpreter, the women were shown their duties. The work was straightforward, but offered a welcome distraction from the uncertainty of their situation. As they worked alongside the American kitchen staff, another layer of fear began to dissolve. During a break, Sergeant Wilson brought over coffee for everyone, including the Japanese women. Haruko, who had never tasted coffee before, made a face at the bitter drink, causing Wilson to let out a deep laugh. Tell her she can add sugar, he said to Suzuki. Plenty of Americans can't stand the taste either without sweetening it up. This small moment of shared humor, the universal human experience of trying something unfamiliar, created a tiny bridge across the vast divide of war. By the 3rd day, a routine had been established. The women worked in the kitchen in the morning and spent afternoons in the processing center, where more detainees were continuously arriving. It was during these afternoon sessions that the most remarkable interactions began to occur. Akiko was helping sort clothing donations when Staff Sergeant Johnson came in carrying a heavy box of supplies. As he set it down, the muscles in his forearms flexed visibly. Akiko found herself staring, not in fear but in genuine curiosity. Japanese propaganda had depicted black Americans in crude caricatures, barely human with exaggerated features. The reality of Johnson, his obvious strength but careful movements, his serious expression that occasionally broke into a gentle smile, contradicted everything she had been led to believe. Later that day, as Johnson was showing Akiko how to fill out inventory forms, she hesitantly reached out and touched his arm, then immediately pulled back, embarrassed by her boldness. I'm sorry, she said in halting English, one of the few phrases she knew. Johnson looked surprised, but then smiled. It's okay, he replied. Through Suzuki, Akiko explained her curiosity. I was told different things about black soldiers, but you're just a person. Johnson nodded, understanding the subtext of her statement. Yes, ma'am, just a person, from Oklahoma. The interaction might have ended there, a brief moment of cross-cultural recognition, but it sparked something more significant. That evening, Akiko told the other women about her experience. His skin isn't strange at all, she explained. It's just darker. And he was kind when I was rude enough to touch him without permission. The next day, as Johnson was supervising the distribution of toiletries to the women detainees, Yumiko approached him with Suzuki in tow. She wants to know if she can ask you a question, Suzuki translated. Johnson nodded. She wants to know if it's true that you were a cannibal before joining the army, Suzuki said, looking uncomfortable. Johnson might have been offended, but he recognized the question came from genuine confusion rather than malice. He had heard enough about Japanese propaganda to understand its source. No, he said firmly. That's a lie they told you. I was a mechanic in Chicago before the war. I fixed cars. My father was a carpenter. We're just people, like you." As Suzuki translated, Yumiko's expression changed from uncertainty to embarrassment, then to something like wonder. The simple truth that the enemy had a job, a father, a life before the war seemed to affect her deeply. Word of these interactions spread among both the women detainees and the American soldiers. Some found it amusing, others uncomfortable, but Lieutenant Franklin recognized its importance. Here, in these small human connections, was the seed of something that might help heal the wounds of war. Franklin had studied the occupation of Germany after World War I and believed that the harsh treatment of the German population had contributed to the rise of Nazism and the eventual outbreak of World War II. He was determined that the American occupation of Japan would take a different approach, firm but fair, focused on rebuilding rather than retribution. "Johnson," he said during a staff meeting, "these interactions between your men and the Japanese women, I think they're valuable. They're seeing each other as people, not propaganda caricatures. I want to encourage more of it, in appropriate settings." Not everyone agreed. Master Sergeant Willis, a white officer who had fought in some of the Pacific War's bloodiest battles, objected. "With all due respect, sir, these people were shooting at us a month ago. The women worked for their military. Some were probably spying or carrying ammunition. We shouldn't be getting friendly." Franklin considered this perspective. The war had indeed been brutal, with atrocities committed by Japanese forces in China, the Philippines, and elsewhere. Many American soldiers harbored deep resentment over the treatment of U.S. prisoners of war by the Japanese. "I understand your concern, Willis," Franklin replied, "but these particular women were nurses' aides. They're not war criminals, and how we treat them now will shape whether Japan becomes a peaceful democracy or remains hostile to us. President Truman has made it clear that our job is to rebuild, not punish." Franklin's reference to the new president was strategic. Harry Truman had recently taken office following Roosevelt's death in April 1945 and had made rebuilding post-war Japan a priority. Significantly, Truman had also issued Executive Order 9981 in 1948, desegregating the armed forces, a fact that would later give weight to the experiences of black soldiers during the occupation. Over the next week, the women's curiosity about the black American soldiers grew more open. It wasn't just Akiko anymore. Several of the women found reasons to interact with Johnson and the other black soldiers, often reaching out to touch their arms or hands in wonder. Masako, with her childhood experience in America, became an unofficial cultural bridge, explaining to the other women that in America, people of different races lived together, even if not always harmoniously. This concept was difficult for many of the Japanese women to grasp, coming from an ethnically homogeneous society that had embraced notions of racial superiority. "But how can different races be part of the same country?" Sachiko asked Masako. "In school, we learned that racial purity was essential for national strength." "America isn't perfect," Masako explained. "There's discrimination. But these soldiers fight for America, even though America doesn't always treat them fairly. That says something important, I think." This conversation was overheard by Corporal Suzuki, who found himself in the complex position of translating between cultures as well as languages. As a Japanese American who had volunteered for the army from an internment camp, Suzuki embodied the contradictions of American democracy, fighting for a country that had imprisoned his family based on their ethnicity. One rainy afternoon, when outdoor activities were limited, Lieutenant Franklin authorized a small cultural exchange. The processing center's mess hall was cleared, and both the American soldiers and Japanese detainees were encouraged to share songs, stories, or demonstrations of games from their respective cultures. Initially, both sides were hesitant, but Sergeant Johnson broke the ice by playing a harmonica he carried with him. The blues melody, soulful and somehow both sad and resilient, captivated the Japanese women. None had heard anything like it before. When Johnson finished, there was a moment of silence, then spontaneous applause. Encouraged by this response, Yumiko offered to demonstrate a traditional obon dance. Without music, she moved with graceful precision, her hands telling a story that transcended language. The evening continued with more music, a demonstration of American baseball signs by one soldier, and a lesson in origami from one of the older Japanese women. As the event concluded, there was a palpable sense that something had shifted. People who had been trying to kill each other weeks earlier were finding common ground in their shared humanity. After the cultural exchange, Akiko approached Staff Sergeant Johnson with Suzuki to translate. "I want to apologize," she said, "for believing the things they told us about black soldiers, for being afraid, for touching your arm without permission." Johnson seemed momentarily at a loss for words. Finally, he said, "No apology needed, ma'am. We all believed things about each other that weren't true. That's what war does." Akiko considered this, then asked, "In America, are you free? Truly free?" The question cut to the heart of something Johnson had struggled with his entire life. How to explain the complexity of being black in America, the pride and the pain, the patriotism, alongside the protest against injustice. "It's complicated," he began. "My grandfather was born a slave. My father fought in the last war, but couldn't get a good job when he came home because of his color. I serve in a segregated unit. But things are changing slowly. We keep fighting for that promise of freedom, even when America doesn't live up to it, because it's our country too." As Suzuki translated, Johnson could see Akiko processing this information. It contradicted the Japanese propaganda that portrayed America as either a racially corrupt society on the verge of collapse or, conversely, as a hypocritical nation claiming to fight for freedom while oppressing its own citizens. The reality Johnson described was more nuanced, a nation struggling with its contradictions, imperfect but evolving. In some ways, this honest assessment did more to demonstrate the potential of democracy than any idealized portrayal could have. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of new detainees, but its impact lingered. For Akiko, Johnson's words offered a new framework for understanding not just America, but her own country's recent history. Japan's imperial ambitions had been built on ideals of racial superiority and absolute loyalty to the emperor. Questioning these foundations had been forbidden. Yet here was Johnson, openly acknowledging his country's flaws, while still affirming his commitment to its better aspirations. As August turned to September, changes came to the processing center. Many detainees, including Akiko and her group, were being prepared for return to their hometowns as transportation became available. Japan was under Allied occupation, with American forces overseeing the demilitarization and democratization of the country. Before their departure, Lieutenant Franklin organized a small ceremony to recognize the women who had worked in the processing center. Each received a certificate of appreciation and a small package of practical supplies: fabric, needles, soap, and chocolate, precious commodities in devastated Japan. As Franklin distributed the certificates, he offered a brief speech that Suzuki translated. "You came here as prisoners, but leave as partners in building a new future between our nations. What you experienced here, working together across differences, is a small example of what we hope to achieve on a larger scale. Take this experience back to your communities as evidence that former enemies can find common ground." For many of the women, this was their first official recognition of any kind. In Imperial Japan, women's contributions had often been expected but rarely acknowledged. The simple act of public appreciation represented yet another contrast with the society they had known. After the ceremony, there was time for goodbyes. Staff Sergeant Johnson found Akiko waiting to speak with him, Masako at her side to translate instead of Corporal Suzuki. "I want to thank you," Akiko said, "for showing me that people can be different from me and still be people." Johnson nodded. "That's probably the most important lesson any of us can learn. When I go home," Akiko continued, "people will ask about the Americans, especially about Negro soldiers. They will still believe the propaganda. What should I tell them?" Johnson considered the question carefully. "Tell them you met Americans who were just people, some good, some bad, all different. Tell them about the music and the chocolate. Tell them what you saw with your own eyes, not what someone told you to see." Akiko nodded, then reached out and touched Johnson's arm one last time, not in curiosity now, but in a gesture of human connection. "Sayonara, Staff Sergeant Johnson. Goodbye, Miss Tanaka, and good luck. As Akiko and the other women boarded the trucks that would take them to a larger transport center, Johnson stood with Lieutenant Franklin, watching them depart. "Do you think any of this made a difference?" Johnson asked. "A few weeks of breaking down stereotypes against centuries of building them up." Franklin shrugged. "History isn't just grand strategies and battle plans. It's also moments like these, individual human connections that slowly change how we see each other. They'll remember you, Johnson. They'll tell others. That's how change happens." Johnson wasn't entirely convinced, but he hoped Franklin was right. He thought about his father's words about America being imperfect, but worth fighting for. Perhaps Japan, too, would find its way toward a new identity, one built on cooperation rather than conquest. As the trucks disappeared down the road, Johnson turned back to the processing center. More detainees were arriving, and the work of building a different kind of peace continued. The war was over, but the struggle to overcome the divisions it had created was just beginning. October 1945, Nagoya, Japan. Akiko Tanaka stood in the ruins of what had once been her family home. American B-29 bombers had reduced much of the city to rubble during air raids earlier that year, leaving behind a landscape of destruction that mirrored the shattered remnants of Imperial Japan itself. Her parents had survived by evacuating to a rural village, but their home, along with the neighborhood where Akiko had grown up, was now mostly ash and memories. As she sifted through the debris looking for anything salvageable, her mind kept returning to those strange days in the Okinawa Processing Center and to Staff Sergeant Marcus Johnson, whose simple humanity had forced her to question everything she had been taught about Americans, about race, and about the war itself. Across the Pacific, Marcus Johnson was being processed for discharge at Fort Lawton, Washington. The rapid demobilization of American forces had begun almost immediately after Japan's surrender, with millions of servicemen eager to return to civilian life. As Johnson stood in line waiting for his separation papers, a white clerk called out, "Next!" When Johnson stepped forward, the clerk barely looked up from his typewriter. "Name and service number." "Staff Sergeant Marcus Johnson, 347200861. The clerk typed efficiently, then pushed a form across the desk. "Sign here. When you get home, don't forget to register for your GI Bill benefits, educational opportunities, home loans. Good stuff for a colored fellow looking to better himself." Johnson signed the form, thinking about how quickly America was returning to its pre-war patterns. The solidarity of fighting a common enemy was already giving way to the familiar divisions of race and region. Still, something had changed, not just in the world, but in Johnson himself. His experiences in the Pacific, particularly those final weeks in Okinawa, had shown him possibilities he hadn't fully imagined before. Back in Nagoya, Akiko had found work as a translator for the American occupation forces. Her English was limited, but with Japanese-American interpreters in short supply, even her basic skills were valuable. Each day she bicycled to a converted office building where she helped process paperwork related to food distribution, infrastructure rebuilding, and civilian affairs. Her supervisor was Captain James Miller, a pragmatic Midwesterner who had been an insurance executive before the war. Miller had no particular interest in Japanese culture or people, but was determined to fulfill his assignment efficiently so he could return home to his family in Minnesota. "Miss Tanaka," he called one morning, "I need these notices translated by noon. They're going to be posted in the markets downtown." Akiko took the papers and began working. The notices concerned new rationing procedures and warned against black market activities. As she translated the technical language, she found herself comparing Captain Miller to the soldiers she had met in Okinawa. Miller was professional but distant, treating the Japanese staff as necessary tools rather than people. It was correct but cold, nothing like the genuine connections that had formed in those strange weeks after the surrender. During her lunch break, Akiko sat with several other Japanese women who worked as clerks and translators. They often exchanged stories about their wartime experiences, each having followed a different path through the chaos of Japan's final military collapse. "Is it true you were processed by Negro soldiers in Okinawa?" asked Keiko, a former telephone operator who had lost her husband at Iwo Jima. The question carried an unmistakable undertone of the old propaganda. Akiko nodded. Yes. They were American soldiers from a unit called the 24th Infantry. And? Were they as savage as we were told? Keiko pressed, lowering her voice despite the fact that no Americans were nearby. Akiko considered how to answer. The truth of her experience contradicted everything these women had been taught to believe, just as it had contradicted her own expectations. They were men, she said simply, just men doing their job. One of them, a sergeant, shared his chocolate with us the first day when we were scared. Another played music that made me think of rainfall. They were nothing like what we were told. The other women exchanged skeptical glances. Japan's defeat had forced many reckonings, but deeply ingrained beliefs about racial hierarchies remained largely intact. Perhaps they behaved well because they had American officers watching them, suggested Harumi, an older woman who had worked in civil defense. Akiko shook her head. Their officer was a Negro too, Lieutenant Franklin. He organized a cultural exchange where we taught them origami and traditional dances, and they showed us their music and games. You actually touched them? Keiko asked, her expression a mixture of disgust and fascination. Yes, Akiko said firmly. Their skin is just skin, different in color but the same in every way that matters. Everything we were told was propaganda. The conversation might have continued, but their break ended and the women returned to work. Akiko could tell her words had made little impression. The others nodded politely, but clearly regarded her experience as an anomaly, not a reason to question their fundamental beliefs. That evening, as Akiko helped her mother prepare their meager dinner in the small apartment they now shared with 2 other families, she tried again to explain her experiences in Okinawa. Mother, do you remember the warnings we received about American soldiers, especially the black ones? Her mother nodded grimly. Of course. Demons who would do unspeakable things to Japanese women. We were terrified when we heard Negro units were part of the occupation forces. It wasn't true, Akiko said. None of it was true. They were ordinary men. Some were kind, some were distant, but none were monsters. Her mother paused in her work, studying Akiko's face. You seem very certain about this. I am. I spoke with them, worked alongside them. One sergeant, Johnson was his name, he told me about his family in America. His grandfather had been a slave. His father fought in the First World War. They were fighting for freedom, even though their own country didn't always treat them as free. Her mother considered this. Unlike many older Japanese who remained devoted to the imperial ideology even after surrender, Akiko's mother had always possessed a quiet skepticism. She had obeyed the authorities and sent her son to war, where he died in the Philippines, but had privately questioned the wisdom of challenging America's industrial might. If what you say is true, she said carefully, then we were lied to about many things. Yes, Akiko replied. We were. The simple admission hung in the air between them, a dangerous acknowledgement that the national narrative that had guided their lives for years had been built on falsehoods. If they had been lied to about American soldiers, what other deceptions had shaped their understanding of the war, of Japan's divine mission in Asia, of the Emperor himself? Meanwhile, in Tulsa, Oklahoma, Marcus Johnson was reacquainting himself with civilian life. The transition wasn't easy. Despite his service and honorable discharge, he faced the same segregation and limited opportunities that had defined pre-war America for black citizens. When he applied for a job at a local garage, drawing on his pre-war experience as a mechanic, the owner shook his head. Don't hire colored in the front shop, he said bluntly. Got a position cleaning up the garage at night if you want it. Johnson declined. He had not survived the Pacific War to return to sweeping floors. Instead, he enrolled at the newly established Langston University, using his GI Bill benefits, focusing on engineering studies. In the evenings, he often found himself thinking about those final weeks in Okinawa, and particularly about Akiko Tanaka, and the other Japanese women who had moved from terror to curiosity to something approaching understanding. You seem distracted lately, observed his mother one evening as they sat on the porch of their modest home. "Is it the war memories?" Johnson considered the question. "Not the fighting. That part I try to forget. It's something else, something that happened after the surrender." He told her about the processing center, about the Japanese women who had been so afraid at first, but whose curiosity had overcome their fear, leading to those strange moments when they would reach out to touch his arms, as if to confirm he was real and not the monster they had been taught to fear. His mother listened thoughtfully. "Reminds me of something my grandmother told me. She was born a slave in Mississippi. She said when emancipation came, some slaves from isolated plantations didn't believe white people were real people either, thought they might be some kind of spirits or demons because they'd never been allowed to see whites as just folks. Had to touch their hair sometimes to believe it was real." Johnson had never heard this story before. "That's almost exactly what happened with these Japanese women." His mother nodded. "Fear and ignorance do the same things everywhere, I reckon. Make people into monsters in our minds." This conversation stayed with Johnson as he continued his studies. The parallel his mother had drawn between American slavery and Japanese imperial propaganda offered a framework for understanding his experiences that went beyond the specific circumstances of the war. It spoke to a universal human tendency to dehumanize the other and to the powerful transformative potential of direct human encounter in overcoming such dehumanization. In December 1945, Akiko received a new assignment. The occupation authorities were expanding their translation services, and she was being transferred to Tokyo to work directly with General MacArthur's headquarters staff. The position represented a significant promotion and acknowledged her growing language skills and reliability. Before leaving Nagoya, she visited her former school, where several of her colleagues had returned to teaching. The principal, Mr. Taniguchi, had survived the war despite losing an arm during his brief military service. He welcomed Akiko warmly, but frowned when she explained her new position. "Working so directly with the occupation forces," he said, choosing his words carefully, "some might see that as excessive collaboration." Akiko met his gaze steadily. "The war is over, Mr. Taniguchi. Japan must find a new path forward. I believe helping ensure clear communication between our peoples is honorable work." The principal nodded non-committally. "Perhaps, but remember, Miss Tanaka, while circumstances change, the Japanese spirit remains eternal. We may bend like the willow in this storm, but our essential nature will reassert itself in time." This thinly veiled reference to enduring nationalism reminded Akiko that many Japanese, particularly men of the older generation, viewed the occupation as a temporary humiliation to be endured rather than an opportunity for national transformation. They might publicly embrace democracy and renounce militarism as required by the occupation authorities, but privately maintained faith in the unique spirit of Japan that had driven the imperial project. In Tokyo, Akiko found herself in a transformed landscape. The once proud imperial capital had been reduced to rubble by American firebombing, with only a few major structures still standing. Amid the destruction, however, new life was emerging. Markets had reopened, streetcars were running again, and construction crews worked constantly to clear debris and rebuild essential infrastructure. Her work at MacArthur's headquarters brought her into contact with a diverse group of American personnel, including several African-American officers and enlisted men. Unlike her experience in Okinawa, where her direct interactions with black soldiers had been novel and startling, Akiko now found herself working alongside Americans of various backgrounds as a daily routine. Among these was First Lieutenant William Morris, a black officer from Detroit who served as a logistics coordinator. Morris had been educated at Morehouse College before the war and brought both intellectual rigor and cultural awareness to his role in the occupation. Unlike many Americans who treated the Japanese with either condescension or barely concealed hostility, Morris made efforts to learn basic Japanese phrases and showed genuine interest in understanding the culture. "Miss Tanaka," he said one day as they reviewed transportation requisitions, "I've been reading about Japan's educational system. Before the war, it seems it was quite advanced in some ways, particularly in mathematics and basic literacy." Do you think it can be reformed to support democracy without losing its strengths? The question surprised Akiko. Most American officers issued directives rather than seeking Japanese perspectives on reconstruction. I believe it can, she replied after considering. Our education was strong in many subjects, but weak in encouraging independent thinking. We were taught to memorize and obey, not to question or create. Morris nodded. That's consistent with what our education specialists have observed. The challenge is implementing changes without appearing to impose American values wholesale. Perhaps, Akiko suggested, focus on teaching methods rather than content initially. Encourage discussion and debate within traditional subjects. An interesting approach, Morris acknowledged. I'll mention it to the Education Committee. This exchange, a genuine intellectual collaboration across the divide of victor and vanquished, represented a dramatic evolution from Akiko's first fearful encounter with Black American soldiers just months earlier. Not only had she moved beyond seeing Morris as racially other, but she had found in him a colleague who valued her insights. In early 1946, a significant development occurred that would connect the stories of Akiko Tanaka and Marcus Johnson in an unexpected way. General MacArthur's headquarters launched an initiative to document the occupation for historical purposes and to counter lingering negative propaganda about American forces. The project involved collecting testimonials from Japanese civilians about their interactions with occupation personnel, with a particular focus on positive encounters that contradicted wartime stereotypes. Akiko was assigned to assist Captain Eleanor Reynolds, a Women's Army Corps officer overseeing the Tokyo portion of the project. Reynolds, a former journalist from Chicago, approached the assignment with professional thoroughness. We need authentic voices, she explained to Akiko. Not just people saying what they think we want to hear. The goal is to document the reality of the occupation, good and bad, but with an emphasis on interactions that promote mutual understanding. When Akiko mentioned her experience in Okinawa, Reynolds was immediately interested. That's exactly the kind of story we're looking for. Would you be willing to write it up as part of the project? Your perspective as someone who moved from fear to understanding would be valuable. Akiko agreed, and over the next week spent her evenings composing a detailed account of her time in the processing center. She wrote honestly about her initial terror upon seeing black soldiers, about the propaganda that had shaped those fears, and about the gradual process through which human interaction had overcome indoctrination. She concluded her account with a reflection. Perhaps the most powerful weapon against hatred is not found in any arsenal but in simple human contact. In the moment when we reach out and discover that the other is not a monster, but a person whose humanity mirrors our own. In touching Sergeant Johnson's arm to verify he was real, I discovered that my own humanity had been diminished by believing he was not. Reynolds was impressed by Akiko's testimony. This is powerful, she said after reading it. Would you be comfortable if we tried to locate this Sergeant Johnson for his perspective as well? Having both sides of the story would strengthen the impact. The suggestion startled Akiko. The idea of reconnecting with Johnson, even indirectly, had never occurred to her. Yes, she said after a moment. I would like that very much. Finding Johnson proved more challenging than anticipated. The rapid demobilization of American forces had scattered millions of veterans across the United States, and military records were still being organized. However, Captain Reynolds was persistent, and by March 1946, she had located Marcus Johnson, now a student at Langston University in Oklahoma. Reynolds sent a letter explaining the historical documentation project and inquiring whether Johnson would be willing to contribute his recollections of serving at the Okinawa Processing Center. She specifically mentioned Akiko Tanaka's testimony and included a copy of her account. When Johnson received the letter, he was initially hesitant. Like many veterans, he preferred to focus on building his future rather than revisiting the war. However, reading Akiko's thoughtful reflection on their interactions moved him. Her perspective offered a window into the impact of those encounters that he had never fully considered from the Japanese side. After discussing it with his mother and several fellow veterans, Johnson decided to participate. He wrote a detailed response recounting his experiences at the processing center, the initial fear he had observed in the Japanese women, and the gradual building of trust through daily interactions. What struck me most, and he wrote, was not how different we were, but how quickly those differences faded once we began to work together. The propaganda they had been fed about black Americans was outlandish, but not entirely different from stereotypes I had encountered at home. In both cases, fear was manufactured to serve political purposes. Breaking through that fear, watching Miss Tanaka and the others discover we were simply human, was one of the most meaningful experiences of my military service. In Tokyo, Akiko received a copy of Johnson's account with a note from Captain Reynolds indicating that it would be included alongside her own testimony in the historical record. Reading Johnson's words, his perspective on those same events that had so profoundly affected her, brought tears to her eyes. There was something deeply moving about this connection across vast distances, about the validation of a shared human experience that had transcended the divisions of war. That evening, Akiko wrote a personal letter to Johnson, thanking him for his contribution and updating him on her life since Okinawa. She described her work with the occupation authorities, the gradual rebuilding of Tokyo, and her hope for Japan's democratic future. She concluded by expressing gratitude for the kindness he had shown when it would have been easy to treat Japanese detainees with contempt. Johnson received Akiko's letter in late April 1946. By then, he was completing his first year of engineering studies and had become involved in early civil rights activities in Oklahoma. Her description of post-war Japan and her continued evolution away from imperial ideology resonated with his own experiences navigating post-war America, where the promise of change coexisted with entrenched resistance to racial equality. He wrote back, describing his studies, his hopes of eventually working in the automotive industry, and the challenges of returning to segregated America after serving overseas. Their correspondence continued sporadically over the following months, creating a unique connection between former enemies who had glimpsed possibilities of human understanding amid the wreckage of war. In August 1946, exactly 1 year after Japan's surrender, Akiko was invited to participate in a public forum on Japanese-American relations, organized by the occupation authorities. The event, held in a rebuilt Tokyo auditorium, brought together Japanese intellectuals, business leaders, and civilians with American military and civilian personnel to discuss the progress of democratic reforms and cultural exchange. Akiko had been asked to speak briefly about her experiences working with the occupation forces. As she prepared her remarks, she realized that the forum represented an opportunity to share more widely the lessons she had learned in that Okinawa processing center. When her turn came to address the audience, Akiko spoke with quiet confidence. "A year ago, I was a prisoner of war in Okinawa, certain that the American soldiers, particularly the black soldiers, would torture or kill me. This was what we had been told throughout the war. Instead, I encountered men like Staff Sergeant Marcus Johnson, who showed me kindness when I expected cruelty, who shared food when I expected hunger, who demonstrated humanity when I had been taught to see only monstrosity," she continued, describing how the simple act of touching Johnson's arm, of physically confirming the reality of someone propaganda had portrayed as less than human, had begun her journey toward questioning everything she had been taught about racial hierarchies, about America, and ultimately about Japan's imperial project itself. "This experience taught me that perhaps the most dangerous weapon in war is not the bomb or the bullet, but the dehumanization of the enemy," she concluded. "When we deny others their humanity, we diminish our own. As Japan builds a new democracy, we must guard against ever again allowing such dehumanization to take root in our society." Her words resonated with many in the audience, particularly younger Japanese, who were eager to embrace a new national identity disconnected from imperial militarism. Some older listeners shifted uncomfortably, but even they could not deny the power of her testimony. Among the Americans present was Lieutenant Colonel James Henderson, who had served as a battalion commander in the 24th Infantry Regiment. After the forum concluded, he approached Akiko. "Miss Tanaka," he said, "I commanded black troops in the Pacific. What you said about Sergeant Johnson, about seeing beyond propaganda to recognize common humanity. That's important. Not just for Japan, but for America too. We have our own struggles with seeing people as people, rather than categories. Henderson's acknowledgement highlighted the parallel challenges facing both societies. Japan's reckoning with imperial ideology and America's ongoing struggle with racial inequality. Both nations were engaged in defining new identities in the post-war world, each confronting deep-rooted systems of dehumanization. In Oklahoma, Johnson continued his studies while following news of the occupation through newspapers and radio reports. The Langston Herald, the university's paper, published an article about Johnson's contribution to the Historical Documentation Project, highlighting the unusual correspondence between a Black American veteran and a Japanese former detainee. The article caught the attention of Dr. William Patterson, a professor of international relations who had spent time in Japan before the war. Patterson invited Johnson to speak to his class about his experiences, particularly about the cross-cultural interactions at the processing center. What you witnessed there, Patterson told Johnson afterward, was a micro-version of the larger process happening throughout Japan. People on both sides moving beyond propaganda to see each other as human. It doesn't always succeed, old hatreds die hard, but those moments of connection you described are the foundation for lasting peace. Johnson nodded. I keep thinking about something Miss Tanaka wrote in one of her letters. She said that in Japan, they're building democracy from the outside in, new institutions, new laws, new constitution, but she's trying to build it from the inside out, changing how she thinks, questioning what she was taught, choosing what to believe rather than accepting what she's told. Patterson smiled. That's insightful. Democracy isn't just a system of government. It's a way of thinking, of relating to others as equals deserving of dignity and voice. This framework helped Johnson articulate something he had intuited but not fully expressed: the connection between his experiences in Okinawa and his growing involvement in civil rights activism. Both involved the essential work of asserting and recognizing human dignity across manufactured divides. In the summer of 1947, Akiko received an unexpected opportunity. The occupation authorities were selecting a small group of Japanese professionals to visit the United States as part of an exchange program designed to expose Japanese citizens to American democratic institutions firsthand. Based on her work with the Translation Service and her contribution to the Historical Documentation Project, Akiko was chosen as one of the participants. The 3-month program would take the Japanese delegates to Washington, D.C., New York, Chicago, and San Francisco, with visits to government offices, universities, businesses, and community organizations. For Akiko, who had only known America through propaganda and later through her interactions with occupation personnel, the chance to see the country directly was both exciting and intimidating. Before her departure, she wrote to Johnson about the opportunity, mentioning that the itinerary included a stop in St. Louis, only a few hundred miles from Oklahoma. Perhaps, she wrote tentatively, it might be possible to meet in person. I understand if your studies or other commitments make this difficult, but I would value the chance to thank you in person for the impact you had on my understanding of both your country and my own. Johnson received this letter with surprise and excitement. The idea of actually meeting Akiko, of continuing in person the extraordinary conversation that had begun in that Okinawa processing center and continued through their correspondence, was compelling. After checking his academic schedule and consulting with his family, he wrote back confirming that he could travel to St. Louis during her visit there. On October 15, 1947, more than 2 years after their first encounter in Okinawa, Marcus Johnson waited in the lobby of the Chase Hotel in St. Louis where the Japanese delegation was staying. He felt a strange mixture of nervousness and anticipation. So much had changed since those days in the processing center, both in the world and in themselves. Would the connection they had formed through correspondence translate to an in-person meeting? When Akiko entered the lobby, she spotted Johnson immediately. Despite his civilian clothes, his height and bearing were unmistakable. For a moment she was transported back to that first day in Okinawa, when the sight of him had filled her with terror. Now she felt only the warmth of recognizing someone whose words and thoughts had become familiar through their letters. "Sergeant Johnson," she said, approaching with a slight bow. "Just Marcus now?" he replied with a smile, extending his hand. "It's good to see you, Miss Tanaka." "Akiko, please," she said, taking his hand. There was a brief, awkward moment as they transitioned from the formality of correspondence to the reality of face-to-face conversation. Then Johnson gestured toward the hotel restaurant. "I thought we might have lunch if that works for your schedule." Over the next 2 hours, they shared a meal and conversation that moved fluidly between their current lives and reflections on the strange circumstances that had brought them together. Johnson described his engineering studies and his hope to eventually work in automotive design. Akiko talked about her impressions of America so far, the overwhelming abundance in stores, the openness of political discussions, the surprising diversity of opinions she had encountered. "The America I'm seeing isn't perfect," she acknowledged. "There's poverty alongside wealth, discrimination alongside opportunity, but there's also a freedom to discuss these contradictions openly that we never had in Imperial Japan." Johnson nodded. "That's what I'm fighting for back home, not to pretend America is perfect, but to hold it to its own stated ideals, to make real that promise of equality." As their conversation continued, they found themselves returning to those days in Okinawa and to the moment when Akiko had reached out to touch Johnson's arm in wonder. "I was so embarrassed afterward," Akiko admitted. "It was rude to touch a stranger that way." Johnson smiled. "I understood what it meant. You needed to confirm I was real, not the monster you'd been told about." "Yes," she said thoughtfully, "but it was more than that. In that moment, touching your arm, I was also beginning to question whether I was who I had been told I was, a subject of the divine emperor, superior to other races, part of Japan's righteous mission. If the propaganda about you was false, perhaps the propaganda about me was false too." This insight, that dehumanizing others involved a kind of self-deception as well, struck Johnson as profound. "That's why these connections matter," he said, "not just for what they teach us about others, but for what they reveal about ourselves." As their meeting concluded, they walked together through the hotel lobby toward the entrance. Both knew their paths were unlikely to cross again soon, yet the significance of their connection remained undiminished by that reality. "I want to thank you," Akiko said as they prepared to part, "for treating us with dignity when we were afraid and confused. It changed how I see the world." "And I want to thank you," Johnson replied, "for being willing to see beyond what you'd been taught to fear. That took courage." They shook hands one last time, no longer in curiosity or wonder, but in mutual respect and recognition of a shared journey from propaganda to perception, from fear to understanding. In the decades that followed, both Marcus Johnson and Akiko Tanaka would continue their life journeys along separate paths. Johnson completed his engineering degree and eventually found work with an automotive company in Detroit, where he also became active in the growing civil rights movement. Akiko returned to Japan after her American tour and helped establish an English-language school in Tokyo that emphasized cross-cultural understanding alongside language instruction. They maintained occasional correspondence into the 1950s, exchanging updates on their lives and observations about the evolving relationship between their countries. Their letters became less frequent over time as new responsibilities and relationships claimed their attention, but neither forgot the significance of their unlikely connection. In 1960, when Akiko published a memoir of her wartime experiences and her evolution toward democratic thinking, she dedicated a chapter to the Okinawa Processing Center and to Staff Sergeant Marcus Johnson, whose humanity had contradicted everything she had been taught to believe about Americans and about race. The memoir became an important testimony about Japan's transition from militarism to democracy, told through one woman's personal journey. Johnson, who received a copy of the English translation, wrote to congratulate her. "Your story is also my story," he noted, "and the story of countless others who have found their way from fear to understanding through the simple recognition of shared humanity." This recognition, that beneath the constructs of race and nation lies a common human dignity, remained the enduring legacy of those strange days in 1945 when Japanese women, prisoners of war, couldn't stop touching black soldiers' arms in wonder, asking themselves and each other, "Are they real?" The answer, discovered through direct human encounter rather than accepted from propaganda, was transformative. Yes, they were real and human as themselves, and in that recognition lay the seeds of a different kind of world. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.